So we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone to today's Rad Death Reads Presents American Indian Horror Story with our fabulous guest we're really excited about, Tiffany Midge. Welcome. I'll do a quick announcement about how we're going to run the Q&A afterwards. So if you can just ask your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll go ahead and pull questions from there afterwards. You can ask them during Tiffany's talk or when we do the Q&A. I'll go ahead and remind you again when we're finished and we're ready to take questions. I'm Sarah Chavez. I'll be your moderator today. I'm one of the co-founders of the Collective for Radical Death Studies and a board member as well. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Collective, it was founded by a group of death and end-of-life academics, practitioners, and activists to actively work towards dismantling oppression, decolonizing death, and centering the experiences and voices of those who have historically been pushed to the margins in death studies, practice, and experience. So for our October Rad Death Reads series, our theme was decolonizing ghost lore. And there was such a huge response and interest in this topic that we really wanted to keep the conversation going. And I realized that discussions about monsters and ghosts and horror might feel a little out of place during a season or time of year where it's really more associated with festive celebrations. But what you may not realize is that during this time of the year, as we're approaching the darkest part of the year, when one year ends and another one begins, for centuries, people have practiced rituals to honor and appease both the dead and monsters. Similar to Halloween, it's believed that the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. And this threshold between the old and the new, the dark and the light, allows the dead, along with demons and spirits and witches, passage between the worlds. So these holiday monsters, for lack of a better word, range from demonic ogres in Japan to witches in Italy to a macabre skeleton horse in the UK. And they really ask us not just to reflect on responsibility for our behavior toward others, but our community and the earth as well. And if you're really lucky, some of these monsters might bear gifts to help us do better in the coming year or in the rest of our lifetimes. It's true, some of them will disembowel you, but that's not the point. The point is that now is the perfect time of year to turn our attention to the monsters that exist within the landscapes that we temporarily inhabit and within ourselves, and deepen our understanding of the American Indian horror story. Our amazing speaker today is Tiffany Midge. She is a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation and was definitely raised by wolves in the Pacific Northwest. Her book, Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's, was a creative nonfiction finalist for a Washington State Book Award and a selection for Spokane Is Reading. She is the recipient of the Kenyon Review Earthworks Indigenous Poetry Prize, a Pushcart Prize, and a Simons Public Humanities Fellowship, and an Eliza So Fellowship. She is a former columnist for Indian Country Today. She taught writing and composition for Northwest Indian College and holds an MFA from the University of Idaho. Her work has appeared in World Literature Today, First American Art Magazine, McSweeney's, Waxwing, The Offing, Gay Magazine, Okey-Panky, which I have to check out just because of the name, Lit Hub, Massachusetts Review, and so much more. Her horror comic collection of poems, Horns, is forthcoming from Spokane Scablands books. Tiffany, thank you so much for being here. I'm turning everything over to you and turning off my camera. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here. Wish I could join you in person, of course. I just wanted to say greetings to anyone that's joined in today. Thank you so much for attending. Um, I'm really pleased that someone asked me to, that I was asked to present here today, because, it wasn't until someone asked me to present on this topic that I really understood that I have been writing in this genre for, a really long time, and I had never quite realized that I had been doing so. And that's strange, I think, to not recognize that. That the book of poetry that I have coming out is, a lot of it is just based on horror tropes in media, etc. And that I've been writing scary stories for a very, very long time. And I'd always thought that I was, sort of writing satire, sort of writing, a personal essays and poetry and things like that. So that was sort of a revelation that came very late to me. And so I'm going to take it a little bit more seriously, I think, because this allowed for me to sort of dive in and take a look at some of these things that happen. So I feel like I'm sort of a little bit of a fish out of water, and I'm just being introduced to a lot of these sorts of ideas and being able to articulate these ideas. One of the places that I've noticed a lot is this online group that's on Facebook. And it's called Resi Ghost Stories. And interestingly enough, Resi Ghost Stories Facebook group has 183,000 members. And there are other groups that are similar on Facebook. Native Ghost Stories, which has 77,000 members. There's another group called Ghost Stories from the Res, 88,000 members. And the questions that I've asked myself is, why are these tales of the supernatural and of ghosts so prevalent among Indian people? And I had a few ideas about that. First, we are a storytelling culture. That's a given. And what better stories are there to tell around the fire than spine-tingling tales about creatures that jump out in the dark? So such stories simply make for great entertainment. Yes, sure, of course. It's also important to acknowledge Indigenous belief systems and how interconnected the world of spirit is to our so-called interpretation of reality, our tangible corporeality, our earthbound forms. And there's this idea that in the spirit world, there's this idea that the spirit world is the actual reality of being, and that the earthbound is the illusion. So there's that. Another reason ties to the idea that Indigenous people revere ancestors, and ancestors exist. Their spirits exist in tandem with our own lived experience. And of course, these are not original concepts. Many, many cultures around the world hold these beliefs. These stories being, witches and creatures that live in the woods and etc. I mean, they're a way to understand the world. It's a way to interpret and foresee and contemplate events, who we are as a people, I think. We use a lot of these sorts of things to examine, our own darkness. And there's a lot of different reasons that we do that. It's important to keep in mind that Indigenous monster stories hold very different associations, and we can't altogether apply our westernized standards to them. Particularly here we are living in this media age, having grown up on television and popular culture. And, also religion, like we all went to religion and we learned about all of these sorts of taboos and evil things. And, we're applying a lot of those sorts of ideas to, these indigenous stories. And, I think that could be misleading and a foolish place in which to examine those kinds of things. In some traditions, excuse me just a second, I'm gonna take a drink. In some traditions, the different monsters are deities. And while there's certainly a great many so-called horror elements to a great many different Native legends, the intentions and the functions and the origins are different. And it might be foolish, as I said, to apply westernized standards of understanding to them. When Western interpretations are imposed upon Native stories, they're flattened, and many people believe that they run the risk of being diminished, of losing their power, or worse. That certain impositions and interpretations can create bad luck or misfortune. And this, of course, differs from culture to culture. There's a lot of variations on that school of thought. The most important thing to keep in mind is to always respect the culture for whom the story originates. And because of American popular culture and media, we're all very familiar with the use of one very specific trope that I'm sure you've all heard of, the ancient Indian burial grounds trope. Movies such as the Amityville Horror, The Shining, Pet Sematary, Poltergeist are among the most famous. While these make for scary and entertaining content, I, for one, enjoy them more than I should admit. But there is a hazard to using this trope. And I hope that future films and storytelling can do better than they have in the past. What these types of narratives are conveying is a story of colonialism, pioneers pillaging sacred lands of Indigenous people and literally building their homes, strip malls, and suburban housing developments over the spilled blood of Native people, and in some cases over the actual bodies of Native people. From these movies, audiences are made to understand that for whomever inhabits these places, their lives are cursed. Strangely enough, however, the takeaway, so obvious in our faces, never quite makes its mark. These narratives are completely mainstream, but Americans still don't get it because these stories are offered as fiction. It's a trope that needs to be laid to rest, so to speak, but I guess it's serving as a cautionary tale to Western expansionism and colonialism, like all good cautionary tales. Another creature monster that we see and hear about in American culture and movies is the Windigo. The Windigo, this is a quote that I found online from the scholar Basil Johnston, who's an Ojibwe teacher and scholar, and he had a horrifying description of the Windigo that I'm only going to read a portion of. The Windigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tautly over its bones, with its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion, the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. And that would be something that you could just look up yourself on Google. And there's 1,000,001 images of artist interpretation of Windigo. And most commonly associated with the Anishinaabe tribes, at least that's my understanding. I always think of the Chippewa and Anishinaabe and those tribes with the Windigo. They appear in several places throughout North America, as well as that. And one function of the tale is a warning against cannibalism. And there are some stories that even cite Windigo for what happened with the Donner Party. And if you Google images, like I said, of Windigo, you'll find multiple art depictions, and they're all equally terrifying. And we see the idea of flesh-eating monsters most commonly depicted within the zombie genre. The zombie genre is its own industry, and Native filmmakers and scholars have really bitten in deeply, pardon the pun. There are college classes in Native studies devoted to it. The most recent film is Blood Quantum, written and directed by Micmac filmmaker Jeff Barnaby. And it is probably the most compelling of all the narratives I've seen thus far. Zombie apocalypse narratives fit very snugly into our national identity of genocide and of the very real horror stories of colonialism, which is why Natives might be so compelled to be fans of this trope. It's our story. We innately recognize it. Mainstream audiences are not going to identify or understand the nuances of movies and TV shows like Blood Quantum and Fear of the Walking Dead. And that's actually a shame because it isn't a convenient narrative. It's difficult to digest. They aren't comfortable concepts. But for Indigenous people, we've lived it and we aren't new to this. The idea that we both celebrate, enjoy, and lament zombies and zombie stories is beyond ironic, but our experiences are never uncomplicated. If you want to talk about ghosts and hauntings, one only needs to visit Indian boarding schools. There's many narratives surrounding the traumas inflicted upon generations of Indigenous people there. Stories about hauntings are very common within such places. Another frightening place is the Smithsonian and other museums that home Native objects. A lot of those institutions are considered haunted. And there's stories about unexplained events that occur. I knew anthropology personnel at the anthropology lab here in the town where I live. And a lot of the personnel and employees, they wouldn't be alone in the building there because it housed Native remains, actual Native remains. And that's a chilling thought. They had a lot of hauntings. If you visit the Smithsonian American Indian Museum, there's a room of moccasins on display. Their art, beauty, celebratory relics from the 19th century. But I always wondered, where did they originate though? I see them as funereal and objects of genocide. But of course, they're not displayed as such. They're displayed as artwork. And then comparing the atrocities and monsters of different people and times remains a complicated topic. Because then when you visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., there's a huge plexiglass box structure that's filled with shoes that are taken from before Jewish people went into concentration camps. And that message was 100% clear. And the message, of course, the portrait of that is extremely disparate and made a massive impression on me when I visited there in, I think, 1996 and went to both places. I just wanted to talk about the idea of Deer Woman for a few moments. It's Deer Woman is one of the most intrepid of Native legends, and it's the story of a deer woman. And the tale differs across many different regions and has been reinvented and retold in hundreds of different ways. An anthology of graphic art and stories was published by Native Realities Press. The collection draws from the inspiration of traditional Deer Woman stories, It's called Dear Woman, an anthology, and it's a powerful collection of stories and graphic art by Native women to bring determination and healing to those in need and those willing to listen with their hearts. In essence, Dear Woman is a cautionary tale to warn mostly men about going off with strange women because they might have evil ideas in mind for the man's fate. Often these are presented as revenge stories. The man has done evil and he receives his just deserts, but not always. The stories do fluctuate, and that's basically the gist. They're kind of a feminine empowerment story, or it has evolved into one. And basically it's men beware. And stories of the supernatural. See what I did there? You'd have to see it. It's SIOUX, supernatural. I grew up listening to my grandpa telling my sister and me indigenized versions of scary stories to tell in the dark. And at the time, I wasn't aware that they were, co-opted stories from this very, classic and well-known book of stories. I don't know if they were like serial stories from magazines or where they actually originated from, but for some reason, my grandfather was a great storyteller and liked to regale us little kids with these really spooky things and stories. And so he often would tell this one story, and I'm going to share it actually. And I thought that it would be appropriate to share that. It's from my first book, Outlaws, Renegades, and Saints, which was published like 1996, quite a long time ago. And the piece actually would be like in my grandfather's voice, as he would be telling the story to us as kids. My grandfather, or it would be in his voice, so it's hard to, it shifts point of view. So that's why I'm trying to like make this a little easier for the audience to understand. Grandpa Dick told us a story about the first man he ever killed, the first white man he ever killed, that is. He was just a boy then, sitting around drinking sweet wine in the Catholic Church, St. Mary's Church, it was called then, with a bunch of my wise ass Indian friends and a skinny white boy who liked to talk big, but probably was afraid of his own shadow, but would never let anybody get the best of him, especially a small band of crazy Indians who secretly he thought himself better than. The church was nestled right smack dab in the middle of the Catholic cemetery, not the Indian cemetery at Chelsea, 5 miles out of town towards Wolf Point, but the Apple Cemetery, the place where the true believers lay to rest. Now, don't you laugh when I tell you this, but it really was a dark and stormy night, and you could hear wolves howling far off in the hills. Only on that night, they sounded more like dead saints up to no good. And there is a full moon covered by dark, angry clouds, and the rain fell in steady, good enough bursts. And we was all drinking this sweet wine, see, and all of us pretty drunk, not falling down drunk, but drunk enough so that every nerve was charged and alive. And we were young and stupid, but didn't know enough to know it. So anyways, the skinny white boy who talked so big, like he wasn't afraid of nothing, and he was all talking brave, that's what we called him, Mr. Talkin' Brave. And Charles Big Horse says, I'll give you $25 if you take this knife and go out to that big cross. You know, that big cross next to the big statue of Mary? and pierce that cross with this knife right in the middle, and tomorrow I'll give you $25. Well, that guy said that he wasn't afraid of nothing. And sure, and it sure was an easy $25, and hell yes, he'd do it. So he went out into the darkness and the rain, and it was an awful scary kind of night. And he really did have a lot of nerve doing that. And we was all laughing when he left, because we all knew that Charles Big Horse sure didn't have no $25. And even if he did, he'd never give it away to some skinny white boys trying to prove he's some kind of warrior. And that boy left and never did come back. But we just supposed that he chickened out and went on home. But the next morning, nobody saw him around. So we all went back to that cemetery. And that's when we found out he didn't make it home. Unless you consider going to the great beyond going home. He was sitting next to that cross, wearing an expression you'd only imagine in your worst nightmares. And sure enough, that knife was stuck through the center of that cross, just where we told him to put it. Only that knife was stuck through his overcoat, too. We figured that the wind was blowing so hard, blowing everything all over the place, that when he reached to stick the knife into the cross, he stuck the knife through his overcoat too, without even knowing. And when he turned back around to leave, he felt something holding him back. He felt something or someone pulling him back, and he died right then and there of a heart attack. Died right then and there of fright. Scared to death takes on a whole new meaning. And I'll be damned if Charles Big Horse didn't scrounge up that $25 and stuff it in that white boy's seersucker suit pocket when he was laying out at the funeral. All $25 in Indian head nickels. Whoever said you can't take it with you was a damn fool. And what's more, that boy was buried in the same cemetery he dropped dead of fright in. Oh, just a sec here. So yeah, my grandfather would tell us these scary tales to tell in the dark, indigenized versions. And I didn't actually know that that story was sort of co-opted from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark until a couple of years ago, when I read that story that a well-known author had put in one of her collections of essays. And so that was really remarkable to have learned that. And it gave me a whole new point of view about just about my grandpa, and insight into my grandfather that I didn't have before. I grew up listening to my mom telling us other sorts of reservation horror stories about the boy with no eyes. I visited the Resi Horror Stories site, and I read a lot of accounts of this idea of people with no eyes, and this idea of that you shouldn't travel by yourself at night, that you should never drive alone at night, because there's this like dark fates afoot, and it never stopped me from driving at night, but I didn't necessarily live in such a remote region. And I can't say that I'm all that superstitious either, but it is spooky when you hear those stories, and you don't want to look in your rearview mirror ever, because you don't know what's sitting in the back seat. And I wrote a poem about that tale of writing in the dark, and about the boy with no eyes. It's very, very short. It's from my collection, in case you're interested. The Woman Who Married a Bear. There's that The boy with no eyes. The boy with no eyes arrives out of dust, oily rags, rust. His twisted face appears in rear view mirrors when you are driving highway lonely at night. He arrives out of the hiss and spit of tires on blacktop, from cold, damp clouds winched from the Missouri, from broke necks, cracked spines, and gossip milled from small border towns like this. He arrives from your perfect and intimate sins, the fretwork of a dark passenger's face. He arrives and departs between the sky's gray cloth and every white cross you see staked roadside. And that's sort of my interpretation of the story, The Boy with No Eyes. And of course, like I said, there's always, a lot of variations to that version, but that was always, particularly compelling as we were kids growing up and driving to Wolf Point late at night. Another story that my mom used to talk about was this idea of orbs of light hovering above the ground. And one night she said that she had seen these orbs of light skipping across the creek, on top of the creek. And I checked in the Resi Stories Facebook group, and they have a lot of different accounts of these orbs of light. And I don't know exactly what I would account those with, other than spirits, some kind of ancestor spirit, but sometimes UFOs, extraterrestrial, that kind of activity, which seems strange, but pretty much everything goes, honestly. There's just all sorts of amazing stories. My cousins would talk about this idea of heyoka spirits playing leapfrog in a hayfield, which is just the most bizarre image. Heyokas are these contrary-wise actual, people within traditional, tribal times, the before times. They're not necessarily spirits. They're actual people that sort of acted as the clowns. They did everything backwards. They were depicted in the movie Little Big Man, or one was depicted in the movie The Little Big Man, and they're just have a lot of character, and they have a lot of function too within the tribal group. But the idea of seeing the spirits, still sort of lingering along the landscape, playing leapfrog in a hayfield is rather interesting. My mother also used to talk about ghosts that lived in the basement, ghosts that she would hear creeping up the stairs from the basement and hear the footsteps. And she has one account where she would watch the doorknob turn by itself. And I don't know if it was locked or if it ever opened, or it was just the doorknob, trying to get in. I don't know what that was all about, but of course it was very terrifying, and it made everyone, a little bit reticent to ever go in the basement. As most houses probably have that same sort of story. And I remember my grandmothers saying things to the effect of, to their women friends to come over and pick at the bones. And it's just this, it strikes me as so odd, but kind of can understand it too in a way. It was an event if someone had a chicken carcass that they invited their friends over or a friend over to come over at the kitchen table and just like suck at all the remaining meat, gristle, and cartilage from the bird. And I'm like one of those people that will just like devour the bird, and I don't leave anything on just the bone. I mean, everything's gone. So that's sort of a satisfying sense. But I just always thought that it was really evocative, this idea of picking at the bones. And although that's not like supernatural, it's still, it's not a ceremony or anything like that. It just feels to me to be like very earthy, even witchy, right? Come over and pick at the bones, they'd say. It sort of feels like spell casting. Indian women sharing, coffee and gossip, and some essential minimal ingredients, taking pleasure from smacking their lips and greasing their fingers and mouths. There's something so rustic and primal in that. And I just had a couple of other thoughts. Is that one thing that's very prevalent from reading posts on the Scary Res Stories Facebook site is that nearly most of the posts are explaining supernatural phenomena with religious prayers, or something referring to things as manifestations of biblical end times. And, those are interesting. And that, again, from what I was talking about before, is just this influence that we have from religion and the Bible, and making these interpretations, or imposing these kinds of interpretations on these more traditional aspects within culture, and, the stories and the legends and things like that. And also just, besides the religion, just the media and the popular culture of television and movies imposing on all of these sorts of beliefs, which, like I said, flattens them and sort of diminishes them somewhat. But yeah, the supernatural is popular, I feel, because it's a link to the realm of the spirit, to miracles and to the divine. And it seems that even if it's spine tingling or scary, people are still willing to engage with these stories because it puts them in touch with numinosity, with other worlds that are separate from religion. So that's pretty much, what time is it? 2:12. So those are some of the explanations that I would have for, people's wanting to engage and wanting to retell and wanting to hear and listen and be audiences to all of these kinds of creatures and legends and ideas that are not particularly comforting. But I think across cultures, we all have those scary stories, and it's fascinating to learn of them and understand them to an extent. And even more so, like with the zombie stories, to be able to apply those lessons to, our lives and our histories. We can interpret current events and our contemporary times, and we can interpret our history a lot of times through those legends and through those tales and those quote unquote monsters. So yeah, that's part of what I've been thinking about. And I wished I had better pictures for you. I wish I had pictures to show you. I had one or two pictures that I put up on a PowerPoint, but I'm technologically compromised a little bit, still trying to figure out the Zoom thing. So I'm just going to end it at that. And if anyone has any questions, I'm welcome to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. That was so fascinating. And especially the storytelling part. It reminds me just how magical and nourishing being told a story is. And I haven't felt that in a long time. So I'm going to carry that into the next year. That is so wonderful. So I know you talked about growing up, hearing these stories from your family, from your community. And this is, again, something that's really common in my community among Mexican and Chicano families. I often joke that we're raised on a steady diet of rice, beans, and fear. Like these monsters, they're part of our family in a way. But and then of course you referenced the scary stories to tell in the dark books, which I didn't know until I watched a documentary this year about the books, and I guess they were an actual collection of folklore and urban legends. Not, I mean, obviously a lot of them are fictionalized, but in contrast, when these books were like at the height of their popularity in the 90s, that there was this whole highly publicized effort primarily led by white American mothers to get the books banned, and have them pulled from all of the school libraries, have them pulled from the public libraries. And the reasons that were most often cited, because they would go and give their testimonies, were things that the stories were inherently bad because the bad guys always win in them, which it's reality. That happens a lot. Or another one, which you mentioned, stories about warnings about cannibalism. There was this one story that really upset them, that they latched onto, that a woman stole the liver of a corpse to feed to her husband. And this is something that we see a lot, like I see a lot on social media, is that immediately a lot of dismissiveness about indigenous practices and the Shika people, because they practiced sacrifice, and how deranged, quote unquote, and sick it was. But there's no acknowledgement or even knowledge of those practices for magical and medicinal purposes among various Western European people and here in the United States, where people consumed parts of corpses for these purposes. So there's a lot there, hiding, covering up, not acknowledging the reality of things. And just like the odd juxtaposition of, not allowing your child to hear those stories or be exposed to the reality of those things. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about why that is, why that is.
Why that is what?
Like why are some cultures, primarily settler, people that have settler ancestry, really find these stories about monsters, about the realities of the difficulties and the grief and the hardships and the violence they're shielded from them.
Yeah, I mean, it's inconvenient for one thing, to think about your ancestry as being monsters. No one wants to think of that, think of themselves in that light. That's a little bit uncomfortable. And I talked about, the imposing one's belief system, and interpreting, these indigenous realities, these indigenous ways, and traditional life ways, through their own lens, and they just don't understand that, and that's just been the confrontation of all world wars throughout the beginning of time. These other people with these strange and sometimes very, very taboo ways, right? But that's a fantastic story. I love that about the, the liver. There's this one story, I think it's a Winnebago story about, Coyote, and he wanted to marry this very, very handsome young dude, the chief's son, and so he made himself into a beautiful young Indian maiden. And he convinced, on the wedding night, he like convinced the chief's son of their nuptials that using the liver of an elk, he'd fashioned, a vagina using the liver of an elk. And he, convinced the whole thing. He was so convincing that he even bore the chief's son, all of these strong young children. And I just like that idea. And I imagine that some sort of Christian interpretation of that might not sit well with some, sort of Christianities because of, first of all, just the whole gender, confusion. Like, he did what? Was he a man? Was he a woman? Gender is fluid. What? That sounds a little bit strange. But if you look to, the Bible has so many like completely bizarre kinds of stories, that people kind of just like accept, and take in wholeheartedly because, it's the Bible. So it's just a matter of, interpretation.
So I'm going to, and you're welcome to head over to that chat. Let me see, pull some great questions. Okay, so here's a question. Western culture has tried to destroy the entire way of life when it comes to Native Americans. I'm wondering if co-opting Western ghost stories is a form of resistance to indigenous peoples to co-opt Western stories.
Okay, let me think about that for a second. Oh, it was helping me to look at it. Let me see. Yeah, I got a little bit confused there. You'll have to maybe back up a little bit. Co-option of like Native stories, co-opting of like my grandfather co-opting the scary stories to tell in the dark, kind of. Is that where we're going with that a little bit?
Okay. There's a little more elaboration now. If you're familiar with the movie series Twilight, with the vampires, the sparkly vampires, I'm wondering if you could give your informed opinion on what you think of natives being wolves. In one way, it is tapping into indigenous tribal traditions, but in another way, it could buy into stereotypical ideas of Native Americans, i.e. stereotype reasoning to why Native Americans needed to be separate on reservations, i.e. they are monsters. Can you speak to this?
Wow. First of all, the Twilight series, that's a very fun series, an incredibly popular series. I don't subscribe to it. In fact, I kind of like mock it a little bit. I don't know that the Quinault tribe has wolf stories. I think I've read articles about that, challenging that idea, but I can't quite recall whether or not they do. I can't recall the details on that. But I would definitely say that Stephanie Meyer took some liberties with some indigenous storytelling. I think that it's kind of a cool idea. And I know that a lot of people are really on board with it, and it's just this sort of cultural phenomena. And a lot of people have a lot of fun with it. I don't know particularly how damaging it would be. I'm not a fan of appropriation or co-option. I believe in, not doing that, not, utilizing, Native stories, Native tribes in that way for commercial gain. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. Yeah, it probably is insulting to interpret, Quinault people as having, monsters. But I'll take a vampire story anytime. But why couldn't they just have used rural people living in that region, you know, because it's a pretty interesting region. I'm from Washington, you know, I've spent a fair amount of time, you know, out that way. And, you know, I don't know why they had to drag Native Americans into it. It would have been a good story just without, because, you know, rural folks can be quite the characters, and quite strange. So that's pretty much my thoughts and feelings on that.
So here's another question from Ramona. What kind of research resources are there for folks like me who want to find out more about regional ghost stories and folklore? I'm in Southern California. My mom's family is from Central California, and my dad's family is from Eastern New Mexico.
Well, I suppose you could go and visit, you know, different areas, different communities, if you wanted to. Make friends with somebody from those various communities, and try to, you know, get to know people. You know, for me personally, you know, I'm kind of isolated here in this part of, you know, where I am, and I don't really actually get out to a lot of community events very often, because I'm, you know, I just like to stay at home, and, you know, I'm kind of like, just, you know, don't like being around people all that much. And so I'm a little bit, so I do rely on the internet for that. And so the one place that I really have enjoyed looking at is the, you know, the Resi stories on Facebook and things. You know, that's like this incredible rich source of information, for me personally. But for a person that's a little more outgoing, I would say just, you know, go to events. You know, take in storytelling events, and, you know, go to basketball games, go to a powwow, and just get to know people. It's the best place. Also books, of course, universities, but it's always good to go to the source. And there's a lot of books out there written by Indigenous people for you to enjoy.
Does anybody have any more questions they want to put into the chat? Last call for questions. Okay. So given that you focus on satire and poetry, do you see yourself ever writing horror?
That was the interesting thing, and I had talked about that in the very beginning of my talk today, was that I hadn't realized how often I use horror elements in my own work, until I was invited to give this talk. And, you know, you'd think I would have figured that out by now, but my mind was concentrating in other places, obviously, you know, but I looked back at a lot of my work, and it has, you know, a lot of horror elements. So I've been very influenced throughout my life, you know, by whatever it was that influenced me when I was a younger person. It was, you know, scary comic books. We read a lot of those, just piles of like Tales of the Crypt. And, you know, my grandfather and my mom, you know, being such aficionados of you know, spooky stories. And so I do have a lot of different stories, and I do have a lot of poems and essays that use spooky elements to them, and I've published them. I haven't ever put them into a collection. But I, you know, I think that I would definitely like to, you know, traverse that genre a little bit and explore a little bit more about that, because yeah, that would be a lot of fun, and I didn't realize how popular it was until very recently, and how hungry people are for those sort of spine-tingling stories. So.
I want to read that immediately.
What's that?
I want to read that immediately.
Oh, yeah, I'll get that out for you.
So since we're coming up, we are at an hour now. I'll go ahead and close everything. Tiffany, thank you so much. This was so wonderful. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experiences. I also wanted to say thank you to Corinne and Dr. Cami for helping facilitate everything for us. and all of you that came today. Thank you so much for coming. I'll see hopefully some of you back here tomorrow for another Rad Death Reads Presents with Callie Simmons' talk, More Than Human, Indigenous Theories of Haunting and Mourning in the Anthropocene. And also I wanted to mention that you can sign up for the next Rad Death Read series, which starts this weekend. It's a whole month of events. And the topic is Decolonizing Disability and Death Studies, and it's curated by the wonderful Dr. Julian Toulis. So again, thank you all so much for coming. We hope to see you soon at another event, and thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you. Thank you very much.